Elizabeth recently moved into her uncle's house in California. She used to live with her parents in New Hampshire. This summer, she convinced her parents to let her go to California to take a special art course. Her father finally agreed, but quickly called up Elizabeth's uncle. Her uncle, of course, urged her father to send her to stay at his house over the summer. He also mentioned he purchased a new house a few months ago, and he also got married again to his girlfriend, Dorothy. Uncle Stuart's first wife, Aunt Amy, passed away a few years after their marriage, so Uncle Stuart didn't have any children. He was living in a little apartment all by himself over the years, just until now. Uncle Stuart kept mentioning it wouldn't be an issue. He and Dorothy were living all alone in the house anyway. There were 3 rooms on the top floor laying vacant. Elizabeth moved into her uncle's new house. She was surprised to see how huge and spacious it was. And even more intriguing were the expensive antique items he decorated the house with. As far as Elizabeth knew Uncle Stuart, he wasn't this well-to-do. "Uncle Stuart, this must have cost you a fortune." "This house is truly worth a fortune, but getting to own this house was a matter of luck for me. I got it at only half the price." "How'd you get such a good deal?" Well, the story begins about a year ago. I started working at this old woman's jewelry shop. She was very fond of me and used to talk to me a lot. She said I reminded her of her late son. Over the year, we developed a close relationship. I looked out for her. She was old and had difficulty doing a lot of things. I helped do her groceries for her and dropped off her medicine, things like that. A few months ago, she told me she didn't want to live in this house anymore. All her family members had passed away, and staying in this house made her depressed. She said she kept seeing her husband or her son walking around the house. She wanted to sell the house, and she offered me the deal first. I immediately agreed. She was delighted that I accepted the offer. She gifted me all her old antiques and moved to the countryside. The house was a duplex. There were 3 rooms on the first floor, Uncle Stuart's bedroom, his office, and his study. And there were 3 more bedrooms on the second floor. Uncle Stuart took Elizabeth upstairs. He opened the room that faced the front side of the house. "You can stay here. This floor is usually always empty. You'll have all the privacy you need." "Uncle Stuart, can't I stay in the room facing the backyard?" No, don't do that. Your uncle hasn't told you yet? The old woman he brought the house from, her husband and her son passed away in that room. It creeps me out every time I go there. The windows view out to the woods. You better stay in this room." "Don't listen to your aunt. The rooms are actually locked up. I stored some of the rare antiques in there. If you want to stay in that room, I'll shift them somewhere else." "No, I think I'll pass." Over the days at the house, Elizabeth tried to help Aunt Dorothy. Aunt Dorothy was in her late 30s, maybe a few years younger than Uncle Stuart. They met online and started dating until they got married 3 years later. Elizabeth had the freedom to bring over some of her new friends she met at the art program. The second floor was all to her. Uncle Stuart didn't seem to mind. But Aunt Dorothy wasn't so fond of the idea. Elizabeth was enjoying her stay at Uncle Stuart's house. But there was one thing she hated. Elizabeth had very light sleep. The slightest of noises woke her up. For the past few days, Elizabeth had been hearing noises from outside her room. It was 1 at night, and Elizabeth hadn't fallen asleep yet. Suddenly, she started to hear a noise. The sound of light footsteps moving around ever so softly. Elizabeth was irritated. She walked out to the hallway. The noise started to get louder. Elizabeth was startled to realize it was coming from the room across the hall, the empty room. Elizabeth slowly paced towards it. Suddenly, she felt someone by the stairs. She turned and caught a glimpse of someone running down the last few steps. Elizabeth became anxious. She followed after. But when she got downstairs, she found her uncle and aunt fast asleep. If it wasn't them, Then who did Elizabeth see? Elizabeth didn't disturb her uncle. She went to the kitchen to get a glass of water. As she walked down the hall, she saw a shadow move across the side of the living room. Elizabeth was frightened. She hurried to her room and closed the door. Things like this happened every night. It was soon starting to become a little spooky. Sometimes Elizabeth got the feeling like someone was watching her. Sometimes she found her door creaked open in the morning when Elizabeth clearly remembered closing it at night. Elizabeth ignored it at first, but soon her anxiety only increased, and so did her paranoia. Elizabeth remembered how her uncle bought the house. She remembered the old woman didn't want to live in the house anymore. She saw her late family members roaming around the house. Was she saying the truth? Was this house haunted? Every time Elizabeth sat in the living room, all the antique pieces of furniture gave her the chills. She hated looking at the weird mahogany-carved owl on the table, the freaky deer head on the wall. She could never forget that night, when she couldn't fall asleep and decided to pace around the house. Elizabeth avoided going to the living room at night. She walked in the halls, and often stopped to admire the portraits. As she was pondering on the artwork, she suddenly started to hear a ticking type of noise. Elizabeth furrowed her brows and followed the sound. She peeked into the living room through the corridor. Elizabeth couldn't believe her eyes. She froze on the spot, her heart beating fast. The little music box she saw, usually sitting next to the rocking chair, was laying on the floor playing its tune, the rocking chair still swaying side to side. And worst of all, Elizabeth knew she wasn't alone. She saw something dark move out of sight. Elizabeth ran back to her room and crawled into bed. She hid under her blankets until she fell asleep that night. The next morning, when Elizabeth was sitting at the dining table downstairs, she overheard Uncle Stuart and Aunt Dorothy whispering something in their room. Where could it go? Do you know how much that cost, Dorothy? How can the antiques from the cupboard just go missing like this? No, Stuart. It was just yesterday that I saw the crystal vase sitting on top of the cupboard. You don't think it's those bohemian people Elizabeth keeps bringing over? These showpieces are rare. They must be worth a lot. Definitely. I've seen similar artwork in galleries and exhibits. Do you think your uncle would sell us these pieces? I don't know, Miles. They were a gift from someone special. I don't think my uncle plans on selling it at all. Sorry, Heidi. It's not gonna happen. Then perhaps you could make us a deal. Bohemian? That's how teens are these days. I don't think it was Elizabeth. Are you sure you didn't misplace it? Elizabeth wanted to talk to her uncle about the previous night, but now she didn't know if she wanted to talk to him at all. That night, Elizabeth laid in her bed, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, hearing the clock tick by. She couldn't sleep just thinking how her uncle was probably doubting her. Elizabeth turned from side to side. She started to hear the noises again. She was disturbed to hear a murmuring whisper from the hallway. Elizabeth got up and put her ear to her door. She was sure someone was out there, but it was so late. Why would her aunt or uncle be here? Had something happened? Elizabeth froze in her tracks. Were they spying on her? Could they really doubt her so much? Elizabeth hurried out, but she was shocked to find the hallway empty. Elizabeth started to inch towards the stairs in the darkness. As she neared the stairs, she realized the murmuring was coming from none other than the locked rooms. Elizabeth put her ear to that door. Suddenly, all the noise stopped. It was pin-drop silent. Elizabeth shook it off and turned to go back to bed. Just when she heard a thud, as if something had fallen down inside the room, Elizabeth was frightened. How could that happen on its own? This room has been locked up. Elizabeth ran down the stairs and knocked on her uncle's room. Within a minute, Uncle Stuart came out rubbing his eyes. "What happened, Elizabeth?" "There's a noise in the other room upstairs. I've been hearing it for days now." Uncle Stuart furrowed his brows. "What?" "Uncle Stuart, I've been hearing strange noises. Sometimes the furniture moves around. Other times when I get up in the middle of the night, I see shadows in the dark. I hear murmuring in the room. Please, Uncle Stuart, I'm totally freaked out. There's something lurking in this house. I didn't want to tell you, but I can't take it anymore. This house is haunted." Uncle Stuart yawned. "All right, let me get the keys." Elizabeth urged her uncle to hurry up. She sprinted up the stairs. The whole house was silent. Not a single noise could be heard other than the creaking stairs her uncle walked up. Suddenly, in the absolute silence, there was a loud, shattering noise of glass breaking. Elizabeth and her uncle flinched and looked at each other. "I told you, it's coming from the room." Uncle Stuart scrambled with his keys and opened the door. He held his head in shock. His jaws dropped. The room was empty, all except for a broken vase on the floor. And Uncle Stuart just barely caught a glimpse of someone jumping out the window. Uncle Stuart ran to the window and looked out into his backyard. Far into the woods, he could see a figure standing in the darkness. Uncle Stuart looked closely. He gasped to see a man, his face covered in black. The man smirked at him before running into the woods. Uncle Stuart fell to the ground. Everything's been stolen. Elizabeth was devastated. All this time she had been hearing those noises, seeing those shadows in the house at night were robbers. Robbers who were entering her room and watching her sleep in the middle of the night. The next morning, Uncle Stuart installed a security system in the house and replaced all windows and locks. Elizabeth went to bed feeling better, finally feeling drowsy, but just as her droopy eyelids closed shut, she jumped to the haunting sound of the music box playing out in the living room. Click on the subscribe button and check out more awesome videos on our channel. And don't forget to press the bell icon because you know it's interesting.